So the basic question, the central question is now, is business as usual any more acceptable for the process of enlargement of the European Union in the Western Balkans? To discuss these issues, we are honored and very glad to welcome at IFRI this morning, Dominique David. Thank you very much to be here. From the Balkan in Europe Policy Advisory Group and researcher at the University of Westminster. May I say also that you published in the last 2022 issue of our brilliant review, Politique étrangère, a brilliant paper which is a part of a very interesting dossier on the relations between European Union and Balkans country. So thank you very much to be here, Donika. Merci aussi à Alexandre Adam. Thank you very much. Alexandre Adam is a former Europe advisor to President Emmanuel Macron, and a member of our French Conseil d'État. J'espère que anyone is Nadia Fayoli is talking, but it's not a good thing. Sorry, Alexandre. Alexandre, you are a former Europe advisor to President Emmanuel Macron and today a member of our French Conseil d'État and a member of the Council of the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, as we say in French. And to moderate the debate, we have Florent Marciac, Deputy Secretary General of the Franco-Autrichien Center for the Rapprochement in Europe. Florent, you are the boss, you are the chairman, and so the floor is shifting to you.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you. So 20 years have now passed since the Thessaloniki Declaration, and Europe is clearly facing a new geopolitical context, so new geopolitical realities. We also have new geographies of enlargement, a series of new debates, strategic debates have opened, and we see this kind of historical disruptions or discontinuities just popping up. But on the other side, when we look at the enlargement debates and the situation on the ground in the Western Balkans, well, to be honest, little change can be observed concretely there on the ground. Bilateral issues remain factors of instability. Accession perspectives, despite the EU proclaiming and trying to revitalize them, remain quite distant and difficult to grasp. And for the Western Balkans, there is a tendency of getting at the periphery of the periphery, as the accession debates and the accession center of gravity is moving towards the east with the new geographies of enlargement. So periphery of the EU, which they have been for 20 years, but the risk also is getting at the periphery of these debates. We have a lot of questions to ask. I mean, try to rethink the enlargement policy. We have just two panelists and a lot of questions. So we will start right now with you, Alexandre. Thank you for being here. The first question is very simple and not so simple if you look at these discontinuities and continuities. So discontinuities in a geopolitical context, but also continuities on inertia of the problems in the Western Balkans. Do we have a new momentum concretely already at hand, moving all the debates forwards? Is it already there, happening?
Thank you, Florent. Thank you, Dominique, and IFRI and FZ for organizing the debates. Yes, clearly, there's a new momentum, but I would say since already last year and the 24th of February, the applications by Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, there's a new momentum on enlargement. Because I think that as the context has dramatically changed, there's a sense, and especially here in Paris, that there's now a need to make this enlargement happen, to make it work for strategic reasons, for security reasons, and with the geopolitical reasoning. So say, not the change, rather the shift or the evolution in Paris is quite clear and was expressed in extremely clear terms by President Macron some weeks ago in Bratislava. I would sum up that, so it's not a question of if, not really a question of when, because it should be done as soon as possible. It's a question of how we do it, how we make it work. But that's what we will be discussing for an hour.
And so clearly, if you look at the French, as you say, shifts, there is a new momentum. I mean, the topic of enlargement was never did like that, or not so present as it is now. But Donica, we see that precisely also for the support France is now giving, for instance, towards the East. But how is it perceived in the region? Do you have a feeling that there is this new momentum which is translating from the EU in the region as some movements towards a new, a clear perspective of accession?
Yeah, thanks, Florent. Very happy to be here. Thanks for, again, bringing up our paper from last year. Always a pleasure to share the panel with Alexandra Adam. Well, I mean, there are conditions for a new momentum. This is how it's perceived in the Western Balkans. It is a new momentum, but the momentum is not about us. The momentum is clearly brought up by Ukraine and Moldova, by the war in Ukraine, more specifically. If you look at the conditions for this new momentum, condition number one is the fact that enlargement back then, because it only included Western Balkans formally and Turkey to some extent, it was largely a foreign policy issue or an EU issue dealt between Germany and France, sometimes Austria or other countries around the region which shared keen interests in the Western Balkans. And now enlargement is a foreign policy issue, but also an issue for other member states as well. So it's a new momentum because now we can talk to the countries in the Baltics, in Scandinavia, about enlargement, and they would know about it. Whether this is specifically a new momentum for the Western Balkans, it's very hard to read because the positive steps we have seen in enlargement towards Western Balkans, they have been sort of artificially pushed by the war in Ukraine. And with this, I'm mentioning visa liberalization for Kosovo, which is not necessarily an enlargement issue. The candidate status for Bosnia. We still have a very unclear path of North Macedonia and a clearer one for Albania. And there is Kosovo with this membership application, which is on hold. There is almost nothing towards Montenegro and Serbia, unfortunately. With Serbia, obviously, there is a state capture issue, but we had hoped, at least for Montenegro, this would have been a new momentum, which we could have used politically.
So if I hear you, well, we have a question which is added to the question of momentum. So how can we sustain this momentum? Alexandre?
Yeah, no, thank you, Laurent, because this was exactly the remark I wanted to make. First, in the debate that we are having now, that is happening as well in Brussels and capitals, a lot of attention, of course, is on Ukraine, to a lesser extent on Moldova, but to a lesser extent on the Western Balkans. The concern that does not happen, that there is not this disconnection, we had it already under the French presidency together with Germany. And during the French presidency and the summit in Versailles, there was a clear request by Chancellor Scholz, by President Macron, that in the statement, Western Balkans are mentioned, but beyond the question of statements, that there's an engagement, a commitment that this new push, this new momentum is not done at the expense, of course, of the Western Balkans. The question is indeed, how do you sustain the momentum? Because we have a momentum during this end of first semester, second semester of 23, because there will be the question of the opening of negotiations with Ukraine, especially. But what happens in January? And here we have also to figure out, because this is in any case a long process, how do we sustain political attention on the process until basically the end of the process. And last remark is, in France we like to proceed by method, and what MFA, Élysée have been starting doing over the last weeks is basically having the list of questions that we have to ask ourselves. The one that you have put on the table today, or that you would like to put about what did not work in the past, what does not work in the process. But we think, they think in the Élysée and the MFA that it goes also beyond the question of the methodology of the process, that we have to have the list of questions we have to raise to make it work.
If I may, I'm sorry, but yeah, it is. I completely agree on this. The new momentum is there. Obviously, is more geopolitical. Yes. Does it give a new opportunity for the EU to actually not only act geopolitically, but also sort out not only the methodology, but also the kind of enlargement that we want? I mean, we have never discussed about what is enlargement. What does it mean now? Does it mean like full membership? Because in the Western Balkans, we are talking about staged accession in the absence of all other alternatives, which obviously seem very distant, like full membership. We came up, think tankers, with something that looks like staged accession, take an incremental approach to that full membership, if any, in the end. So I believe that is up to the member states, but also together with us, Western Balkans, but also Eastern Partnership region, to sort of decide what is the overarching goal, how does it look? So in order for us to know the destination and then find out how to get there, because methodology proposed by, obviously this debate was led by the French, it's merely a ticking box bureaucratic process. We want to know how to deal with it politically.
We will come back to this question. So before we do, I'd like to ask you one more question, since Alexander was not in, so coming to Ukraine and Moldova. And we agree on the fact that the push is first of all going eastwards. Then we can hope that the Western Balkans are somehow taken in this dynamic. But you see that 100% now, for instance, there is discussions about opening essential negotiations for Ukraine and for Moldova. Also, France is far from being against that. So it is also part of the shift you've been mentioning, Alexander. Is it a good news for the Western Balkans to see movements, but in the East?
I already can imagine the headlines if, the negotiations are open for Moldova and Ukraine, especially for the fact that Ukraine is a country that is at war, very problematic, and has, obviously very, very questionable eastern part of it. How will it look like after the war? And then we have countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, which are actually, Kosovo cannot even dream of accession negotiations now, especially with the sanctions. I would also like to highlight the fact that we in the Western Balkans should not see this as a competition. We should see this as a new opportunity. I'm not saying that we should couple with Ukraine and Moldova, but this is a new positive momentum, which clearly sends a message that enlargement is not dead. If you want to do it, if you are committed to it, then maybe it is possible. So this is probably a signal for all autocratic regimes in the Western Balkans, especially Serbia, that, it can happen if you want to happen and if you are committed to it.
Okay. Let's come back then to the question you raised about drawing a little bit lessons of what is not working, Alexander. We have what we could call the generation Thessaloniki, 20 years of people, if they have not moved in the EU, who remain very doubtful of the credibility of EU proposals, and so the accession. Now, we can approach this generation Thessaloniki in two different ways. On the one way, we have the EU saying that the enlargement policy is the most effective foreign policy tool it has. I would add, when it works. And when it doesn't work, then we have the EU saying, well, this is because they are not doing their homeworks. So it's actually a foreign policy tool which is effective only when it works. Otherwise, the credit is not ours. How do we avoid, before trying to fix that, but not having a new generation Versailles? What lessons should we be taking? Taking from what has not been working. What are the main things we have been really blind with? Why we have not been able to project this influence and shaping a little bit this region. Alexander.
Thank you, Florent. Two remarks. First, I'm not of the idea that enlargement policy is a foreign policy tool. I mean, if the effect in the end is stabilization and security in the Western Balkans, of course, that's great. But the aim of the enlargement policy is to have new members in the EU. So it's basically to have co-legislator at the table of the Council, of the European Council, in the European Parliament. And so it's basically making sure that when we are 35, we will be in a position to adopt the same, it's not the possibility to adopt, because the governance for me is not the main issue, but that the kind of standards that we will be able to adopt will be the same as before. So we have transferred competencies to the EU. We want to make sure that we will be able to exercise in the same way once the EU has enlarged. So don't see it as a foreign policy tool. I'm also not very comfortable with this debate that has been running over the years about the EU credibility. Because in the end, it's about blaming and shaming. But in the end, the accession process is a lot about the reforms that have to be made by candidates. But basically, with the credibility issue, you can go on and on who is to blame. So let's blame the process. No, but what we've seen, what happens, the problem with the process, and I would say thank you, Danica, for saying that France launched the discussion. It was true on the political level, but I would say that when we launched it in 2020, it was thanks to the work of Western Balkans think tanks that had described what was not working. And it's basically about incentives, lack or powerless, would say, incentives in the process, because the process is too long compared to political cycles, therefore not rewarding enough when progress are made, and with too few supports, both financial, that there's this figure that is usually used that there's a difference of 8 times between Serbia and Bulgaria in the level of funding from the EU, and as one of the aims of the enlargement process is to foster economic and social convergence between candidate countries and member states, then you see that you have an issue with the funding that we're putting into the process. And the technical support as well, I think, is really insufficient. There's something I don't understand in terms of training of the administrations of the region, is that there are not seconded national experts from the region into the commissions. I think that member states, and that's the case for France, we're not sending enough international technical experts, as we call it in France, in the region. We have one, I think, in North Macedonia, but there need to be, I think, a pool of member states sending experts into Western Balkan administration to help doing or aligning, doing transposition of the EU acquis, etc. And then, of course, there's the process, all the papers about stage accession that Pierre Nérel as well. It's about this, the objective, about blurring the border or the distinction between being out and in. But there's also, I think, wider issues, one of them being, especially in France, the issue of the public opinion, and the fact that I think that in the French public opinion, we still have not digested the 2004 enlargement. The way people represent enlargement is still informed or shaped by the debates about the Polish grammar, about the treaty on the constitutional treaty in 2004 and referendum in 2005. And so we need also to have a new narrative about enlargement, much more public or PR, both from the French government, but I think also from candidate countries into member states, to explain why, of course, accessing the EU is good for candidate countries, but also why it can be good for member states. And we'll finish with that. Edi Rama, I think many times I said, look, for us getting into the EU is not only good for the EU, for us, but we can bring things into the EU. I want to believe it, but I mean, we need explanations in a way, or proofs, or we need a clear, can you call it narrative, or I mean, clear communication strategy, why this would be good as well for French citizens, that we have new partners into the EU.
And we will go more in details on that, and so I really discuss what needs to be done. But you point, there's three elements why, well, the accession, which we are blaming policy, has fallen short of delivering the Western Balkans much closer or in the EU. You say it's been too long, too lengthy process. There is the role of you citizens and the opposition and how to explain. We have been communicating that, the narrative and the lack of incentive, somehow a problem of incentive. Donica, well, this is it's not about historical materialism, but if we just pour more money and more expertise and more, if we had more technical assistance, how much do you think that it would have been a key in changing really much the speed of the process and the trajectory, giving movements?
Well, I mean, yes, it would have. It's imperative to help the Western Balkan countries in terms of building in the right infrastructure to deal with EU reforms. I mentioned it previously. It is extremely ambitious to have launched this ambitious agenda of EU reforms in a region which not only lacks democratic culture, but also lacks basic infrastructure to actually deal with the reforms. They are expensive and they need more expertise. So this is, imperative. I mean, we are talking about when Thessaloniki was launched, Kosovo was not a state. So it did not have institutions yet. So you can imagine the extent of which basically needs assistance in this regard. But this is not enough. Because let me go back to your question about the Thessaloniki generation. When Thessaloniki was launched, the EU political conditionality as a tool for transformation was flourishing, right? There was 2004, the Central Eastern European countries, it really showed success. And then the ambition was clearly tried to be replicated in the Balkans as well. But in the Balkans, there was a catch. The same toolbox couldn't be used because it was a post-conflict region. It had difference, in addition to the fact that we had no institutions apart from Serbia, which had and Croatia, more solid infrastructure, the rest didn't. There was this stability factor, which was very important, for which the EU wasn't ready with that unsharpened toolbox to deal with. Now we are having this new momentum in the East with, without a point of reference for success, because there is this Thessaloniki that is ongoing, which hasn't, proven successful yet, apart from Croatia. And in addition to the stability factor, which was in the case of the Balkans, pertinent, now we have security, which is in the case of Ukraine, the security element, because the country is at war. So what we need now is sharpen this toolbox to see how does this enlargement toolbox work in these two different regions, which are quite different but share similarities. The second one is political will. In addition to all this beautiful access to funding, expertise, and all provided by the EU, which has been quite present in the Balkans, not as much as in the EU member states, but still, there is the need for political will from the member states who are dedicated, keen to make this work. I mean, we can do our homework, but if one of the member states says no, in the end, we're not going to make it, right? I mean, look at the case with Bulgaria and North Macedonia. So we really have to make sure that all member states are on board, all member states are unified in their approach towards enlargement, and we know where the destination is and how it's going to look like. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
You're raising in this comment two different factors which have limited the effectiveness of the policy. First, the security and the bilateral issues, which have been interfering with our accession policy. The second one is the unpredictability of the process, because some member states, particularly neighbors, but not only. I mean, for Kosovo, you also have states who do not recognize Kosovo. That adds a layer of unpredictability on how things will go. And this unpredictability in the process, the political dynamic behind, which has also been disrupting somehow the process. Alexandre, how much, well, we had this policy which was a policy, but we see that beyond the lack of incentive, beyond the fact that it's been too lengthy, there is this very, very political dynamic behind, which has been also a factor of problem, the cooptation logic of the accession policy. Do you see that as a factor with some concern, something to address, or is it like something which can just fix with policy tools, more money, more assistance, more advisor? How much of the reflection should we have on member state sides to deal with these issues which so far are not included in the accession policy?
If your point is about cooptation and therefore consensus?
Yeah,
or
I mean, the accession policy somehow has been limited by the fact that the member states also have a portion of their own national interest and bringing them, so reflecting them in this accession policy. So whatever we try to fix on the policy sides, the political logic will remain problematic if it has been problematic before. How do we deal with these two sides of the process, the policy side and political sides?
That's an excellent question, but I don't think that there's a silver bullet answer. Because this is a political issue, and by the way, enlargement, we call it a EU policy, but it's not really an EU policy because this is not an EU competence. The EU cannot decide on its own composition. And therefore, I mean, trying to answer your question, we'll try to address one idea that has been floating, that we should move to qualified majority in the enlargement process. The thing is that politically, in the negotiation process, that means that if you minorize a member state in the process, you will still encounter the problem in the end of the process when you will have to ratify the accession treaty. Because this is by unanimity, or not even by unanimity, this has to be ratified in all member states. So if you take the example of Bulgaria, take the assumption that we will have minorized Bulgaria last year. In some years from now, when it comes to ratifying the accession treaty for North Macedonia, we would still have a problem. So I would not put the dust under the carpet on this, but also legally, I don't see how you do it, as this is not a EU competence. This is international law, and so going into qualified majority on this, I don't know how this works.
Yeah. So this is something which remains a bit in a blind spot so far, how to handle that. But we will come back on what needs to be done more specifically and discuss a bit more this qualified majority voting proposal. Donika, on the other side, so in the Western Balkans, on bilateral issues, also on these political dynamics, the EU has tried to play a role, and the European integration project has been projected as a peacemaking project. So it's a reconciliation project if you reflect the Franco-German history. The EU has tried in a more structured way, as it has tried anywhere else, with the EU facilitated dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade. How has this attempt in forging a solution to these issues, bilateral issues, how has it intersected with the attempt of the EU to push for democratization, building the way to the EU for these two states? Has it been a success? Obviously not so much, because if you look at the situation, but what do you think?
Well, I've been working on this for almost 4 years on my PhD thesis. It is this toolbox that I mentioned before. The EU became more ambitious in what it wanted to reach and achieve with this toolbox, but the toolbox was shaky. So you have a very basic tool, but you want to build an airplane with some basic tools that you can use only for bicycles. So what happened is that the EU became more ambitious and put in too much ambition, in this toolbox, which was already shaking. Because the EU built on its ambition to take a leading role in peace negotiations, and the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue would have been the best case, because look at the case. I mean, it's perfect. It's a perfect case of structural diplomacy in which the EU could have used all possible tools to actually fix it. It has EU presence in both countries, Kosovo and Serbia. In Kosovo, it had EULEX with executive powers. It has an EU membership card. So basically, it had incentives, it had tools, but it just was the question how. which was pointed out in the beginning. How do we use these tools to actually achieve something that looks very simple, but is not? So what happened in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, it was a smart idea probably in the beginning to interlink it with the EU membership process, because carrot and stick approach. But what happened is that the EU kind of completely forgot about the reforms, because it was commitment to the dialogue, commitment to stability in exchange of EU membership. So every time it became transactional, not transformational. So the EU membership was used by, unfortunately, especially Vučić in Serbia, like, I will provide stability that you desperately need in relation to Kosovo. Incrementally, I will give you on the way some very, very small carrots, but I want membership. I want more financial incentives, while keeping Russia in the game the whole time by maintaining this open dispute with Kosovo. So what we see today is a situation which looks worse than in 2008 when Kosovo declared independence. Because for the first time, we see KFOR soldiers wounded on the ground. It did not happen when NATO troops deployed in Kosovo. The French troops were in Mitrovica, and nothing had happened back then. And now it is happening 20 years after. And 20 years after putting immense diplomatic efforts to solve the issue, plus the EU membership process. So clearly something went wrong, and I agree with Alexander, is because it's too long. The process is too long, that you cannot provide incentives. You don't have sustainable partners on the ground to actually deliver fast. And what we learned is that first, you cannot be constructive and ambiguous at the same time. The EU should forget about this, because this is what it did not work in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue on bilateral issues in general, because, I mean, look at North Macedonia, change the name and there is nothing. I mean, Moldova will get accession negotiations just like that, but then you see North Macedonia changing its name and not getting it. Or getting it like with a lot of problems with Bulgarian concessions. And then the second one is that incrementalism doesn't work. I mean, it's if you take very slow incremental approach, then you sort of blur this, destination, and it became like the navigating tools, sort of get lost on the way. And this was the case with Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. We don't know what's the overarching goal. There is this normalization that the EU mentions, but we don't know how this normalization will look like, and we don't know how to get there. So taking these small steps would be strategically okay, but not in the case when there are political elites on the ground who share no political will to solve the dispute and use it more as a tool to blackmail the EU and trap it into stability cycle, rather than use it as a tool to not only solve the issue but also make it to the EU.
Do you see it this way, Alexander? You were saying about seeing the accession policy as a foreign policy tools. There is this strong dimension, and foreign policy would allow us to play with this constructive ambiguity as one of the tools to achieve our goals. But Dominika explains that it has not worked this way. I mean, constructive ambiguity is not a golden rule. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And incrementalism has been a source of vulnerability. Do you also draw the same assessments of this failure to deal with these hard security issues, not talking about Bosnia, but of the EU's involvement in the region?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think I share the assessment. I see what you mean with this constructive ambiguity, but that is also part of how we see the process and the end goal of the process, whether we're doing the process just for the sake of the process and its transformative or expected transformative power in terms of stability of the region, or whether we're really aiming at accession. And I think that what has changed is that now we're really aiming at accession. And one of the things that was mentioned, and it's part of the incentive discussion, to make it more readable or concrete in terms of endpoints or perspective, is the question of the tentative date or the date of accession. Issue on which I was not, I think, a big fan during the past years when the debate was on the table. Mainly because I couldn't see how you get the incentive to do reforms if there's a kind of assurance or insurance that you will get into the EU at some point. On the other hand, because of what we've said before on the lack of reward for especially in political class of the reforms to be carried out, now I think that a date should be set, but in the form of a contract, that it would be for the candidate countries to explain or make public the date by which they think that they can be ready to get into the EU. But a contract, because the EU on its side would pledge to be ready to welcome the candidate countries, i.e. having reform to the extent necessary, of course. And that's also why I think that it is good that right now we have also, because the EP is doing this, but it was also discussed during the Swedish presidency, that there are the two parallel tracks of EU reform and enlargement process, and not being seen as one to have to happen before the other, but that the two are carried out at the same time.
I will definitely come back to this proposal and the idea of date. I think this reflects a little bit the approach which was in the Agenda 2000, although there was no date, but there was this idea of prospective assessment and self-assessment on how fast the reforms could be done, submitted by the candidate states. But I would like to ask you one small additional question about the constructive ambiguity. Clearly, the countries of the region face different kinds of issues. I mean, we have Montenegro, which is a sovereign country, which has no bilateral issues, or maybe has, but with North Macedonia, let's take, they have no bilateral issues. And we have countries with very deeply contested sovereignty, internally, externally. Now, from a strategic point of view, if we think about enlargement based on merits in a regatta style, it means that we have someone in the end of the chain. Someone in the end of the chain, which might at some point end up in a hole. We might design a strategy for the fittest, but what do we do with the ones who are struggling much more? So how do we approach to have a coherent strategy, which is also making sure that we do not open vulnerabilities with the weakest? Should we not, more clearly said, focus on the weakest points of the countries rather than the fittest in thinking about reforming our process?
I wouldn't want this question.
And the first question is the regatta principle still up to date, or have we actually really applied the regatta principle in 2004, 2007? I mean, we have applied it to the extent of Bulgaria and Romania. I'm not sure really we have applied it regarding the others, but and what I understand from friends from the region, from Western Balkans, is that maybe regatta principle for the Western Balkans is not that much a good idea, because it is not actually always as objective as we would think. And in your question, there's the question of whether the process is one size fits all, or the same process for everyone.
Keeping in mind that we will have a process applying to Ukraine and Moldova.
So no, for sure, but for me, yeah, that this is the underlying question of the first question, whether we should have the same process for Ukraine and Moldova on one hand and the Western Balkans on the other. The end point, it's the standards, what we're expecting from newcomers, would say. But we need to have, I think, a reflection on what we are actually expecting from candidate countries and their readiness when they enter. That means also we have to be clear, but on the EU side, about the share of transformation that we expect for the process itself to make happen, but also the transformative power of the belonging or the member state status, or because of course the economic and social development is much stronger once you're in the EU. So at some point that's I think really the key issue is about the democratic standards, the rule of law. But here too, I think that we need a questioning about what we, and that's a really tough discussion, but what we really mean by rule of law. Because this is a legal, there's a legal dimension of it, the extremely important one about the independence of the judiciary, fight against corruption. But to some extent it has, or expanded it to also societal values. When the question of rule of law sometimes in the European Parliament is expressed, it's also about this. And so I think that we need to be clear what we expect from candidate countries about this as well. Because societal issues, be it how do you say, equal rights, marriage, or abortion right, etc. It took a long time for member states as well to get to that point. And we see also in the EU, we see member states backsliding, and we see member states going forward, taking the example of Estonia recently. So here, I think that we need, I don't have, the answer to that, but I think to make it, or to sum up, that the core issues are about rule of law, and being clear about what it means, democratic principles, and that this should be the standard on which we're assessing really the progress of the candidate countries.
Danica, I'm not asking you the same question, but a little bit differently. We have a tendency, and we did it with North Macedonia, to find good pupils to try to reinvigorate a process which is a little bit stalled. Regardless of the fact that we sometimes lose the good pupils on the way, now we're thinking the same about Montenegro, for instance, trying to find a good story. Do you think, is it a good way to push the process forward, to look at the good pupils, rather than, well, it's more convenient, clearly, to look at the good pupils than to look at the countries that are more complicated? How do you see that from your perspective?
Well, first of all, this EU membership process in the Balkans became just a stability sort of project of the EU, short-term stability. So I'm not sure what's a good pupil and what's a bad pupil in the Western Balkans. Because, we know where the problem is. And again, going back to the toolbox, the EU wasn't ready to deal with countries which didn't want to join the EU and are in the process, because, or are blurred in terms of, their ambition to join the EU, because you have the case of Serbia. In the Central Eastern European countries, you had countries which were willing, so the political will or the strategical, alignment wasn't a question, right? It was just a matter of doing the reforms and entering the EU. In the Western Balkans, we deal with Serbia, and clearly Serbia keeps, 50-50. It's blurred, like there is a very divergent, and not just the government, because people try to put it on Vučić. They say like, oh, it's, Vučić sort of strategy. It's also the public opinion, because public opinion polls, show that divergence, and it is because of the political elite in the way that, Vučić has nurtured this, like, oh, there is the EU, but there is also the Russian strategic alliance. So I'm not sure what's the good people, what's the bad people in the Western Balkans. What I'm sure is that we had some cases in which there was hope, and that hope was North Macedonia, which in a way we saw this, really political will, not only to fix the bilateral issues, but also to do the reforms. And honestly, we were very ambitious towards Zaev's government, because I am from the region and I know how difficult it is to disentangle, all the state capture that had happened for decades, while Macedonia was going through this international isolation and the big question mark on its future because of the name issue. So, and then there was Montenegro, in which, we saw Đukanović going down and everybody was like freaking out. We are losing our partner for dialogue, because the others are worse, without knowing what the others are, without knowing what the other stands for, without giving it a try to actually do the reforms or not do, but, to gain this, to get this success story. And then there is Kosovo, which, clearly there is still democratic critical mass existing. We change governments through elections. We are demanding towards, democracy and EU integration, but there is very, significant political lack of will, to actually move towards Kosovo. We are dealing with sanctions now, Dodik is not, and which is not, even after not aligning with the EU on Chapter 31, which is in, the strategic alignment in joining the EU with sanctions towards Russia. So in all this, I want to do, and what I would want the EU to do is first, yes, the time frame is very important, not just on enlargement, but also on bilaterals, because you cannot keep an open-ended process. It doesn't work that way. The longer it takes, the more emotional it becomes, the more problematic it becomes, because the longer it takes, especially in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, we saw that the political elites have, especially in Serbia, have used it to nurture their populist, nationalist narrative. And the second one is that the longer it takes and the longer Vučić sees that the EU is desperate for stability, the longer and the more he nurtures the instability pockets he has created, because there is one in North Kosovo, there is one in Bosnia, and there is clearly in Montenegro. So they are all like small ticking bombs which freak out the EU, and no one talks about reforms. Everybody talks about how do we appease Vučić in order to maintain this stability. What I would also want from the EU in the enlargement process, in the bilaterals as well, to not put pressure on the weakest link just because they are weaker party in the process. And in this case, it's North Macedonia and Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a member state, North Macedonia is not. So you have to do whatever the stronger party wants, because we need to please the stronger party who can block you. And then also in the case of Kosovo, Serbia, a lot of pressure is put on Kurti just because there is this weak link, there is Kosovo, and then let's please, the party that can be more problematic, which is Serbia. This narrative should change, this approach should change. And that's, the good people, bad people. Focus on those that actually have some political will to do the reforms, but also not put pressure on weak parties just because the EU can, because it's not going to bring success.
So you've opened now the field of question about what needs to be done, and also you already launched a couple of ideas. Clearly, the EU is not, it cannot be an exoskeleton fixing all the issues from the outside, and this kind of expectations, it's not working. It's just not working for many reasons. But it should be playing a role, a timely role, in a reasonable time frame. It's not been working so well so far. So what should be done now in this new momentum, for the new momentum not to be lost, building on what we might have learned from our limitations of the past? What would be the path to explore in priority, according to you?
Thank you. As I told you, the work that is carried out right now, and this is also discussed in corridors at the European Council during those 2 days, is more about having the list of questions that we have to address than having already answers to those. And drawing the lessons from what has not worked, but we have discussed it already, is being done. But I think that not everything is about the process, and not everything is about how to adapt the EU. Of course, this is a big part of it. When it comes to adapting the EU, basically the discussions are around governance and budgets. But to be frank, for me, those two issues, governance and budget, are workable issues. I think the big shift, or big, what was really new was the 2004 enlargement in terms of decision process, especially in terms of budget as well. But what was shown at the time is that this is manageable, and that we did it. So I do not have many concerns about this. On the process, we can discuss, if you wish it, about the different models of stage accession. But for me, what really needs to be on the table of EU leaders is some of the issues that we have discussed. How do we settle, how do we fix the disputes in the regions, especially when it comes to territorial disputes or minorities? I don't know if there's there again one solution fitting for all, but what I'm convinced of is that we should not try to ignore disputes that exist today, but low-key, and just praying for those not to become too much in public or not to make too much noise before accession, because at some point that will happen. So I don't know if this means having a kind of big conference where you try to address everything, maybe not the best way to do it, but at least starting by being aware that there are, of course, Serbia-Kosovo issue, there is the North Macedonia, Bulgaria issue, but these are not the only ones. And in this regard, of course, we could hope that we would get get the Western Balkan countries into the EU without fixing the problem. And the pyramid, the dispute between Slovenia and Croatia, showed that, well, today it's not that much of a problem anymore. Sometimes it's raised again, but it's not in a way blocking the EU. But that's quite an ambitious bet to do for the rest of the region. Second issue I think we really need to tackle is the demographic one. And have an open discussion about this, because if we don't address it, we will have a further brain drain from the region, just for, say, the sake of the labor market of some member states. And on the other hand, if we don't address it, we will have the freedom of movement of persons issue that showed as well that if not addressed properly can have political consequences. And of course it's not the only reason, but Brexit also showed that an opening that came too fast or too quickly of freedom of movement of workers after 2004 had consequences. So this is an extremely sensitive issue, but that needs to be addressed. I mentioned as well already the rule of law and distinction between rule of law and values, and here too, just to repeat myself, we should be clear about this as much as this is possible. And as well, here too on the member state side, public opinion. And here, I mean, this is pretty much this is a lot for France that France should do its work on this. Explain already from now what this means, explain that this will happen at some point. This is as well a very sensitive issue because of the perceptions, but we should not do as this will not happen.
Mm-hmm. Several points. We will come back to them and to the others, but before we talk about bilaterals and bilateral issues, in the previous enlargement round in the G2000, there was an approach to deal with that. When the countries, it was indicated that either countries should solve bilaterally the issues, and if they cannot, they should just submit it to the International Court of Justice for a binding ruling on that. It's been applied with Hungary and Slovakia, so the Dam and Danube, but then we lost track of this possibility of having this, like a coherence. If they cannot do it themselves, there is someone who can do it. Is it some proposals which would be worth reviving? Knowing, I will come to Donika, that so far this kind of proposals have not been implemented very well. So should we come back to this kind of proposal and solve this in a structural way? All these issues, or find a way?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the possibilities for sure, but here I would like to make a call for interest. No, but there's really a lot of knowledge here in this room, but also behind the screen for those who listen to us. A lot of knowledge about data, about what worked, what did not work during the previous enlargement. And I think that today, as EU governments, as the Commission as well being tasked to do, are willing to make the process work and work swiftly. all those questions that I have raised, that other governments are raising, we will need help, to be frank, from think tanks, from researchers. We will need help on new ideas, but also what have worked or not worked, as I said, during the previous enlargement.
Danica, so we stay and then we'll move to the other points, but on the bilaterals, what about this idea on how the involving an external actor if the bilateral, the two parties cannot deal with it? It's been tried, but not exactly by the EU. In North Macedonia and in Kosovo as well. The EU was the EU so supportive in the end of the process of externalizing the solving of the issues externally?
Well, I mean, let's go back to a very important point for Kosovo, the 2010 ICJ's opinion on, the declaration of Kosovo's independence. If the EU wanted to actually externalize it, it could have done it back then, but it started the process of negotiating something that looked like normalization immediately after the ICJ decision. And for me, it's also very disappointing that this decision wasn't even enough for the 5 non-recognizers to actually soften their approach towards Kosovo, to sit and discuss, look, there is an opinion, that there is this International Court of Justice, and let's, based on that opinion, let's take a decision whether this is the time to actually recognize Kosovo, because that's where the problem starts for Kosovo.
The opinion was saying
before.
The opinion of the ICJ was saying that, just to remind everybody, because that's the declaration of independence did
not violate the international law. So basically, it could have, even used by Spain, because there was a decision, and they have problems with international law in relation to Kosovo, not only for the declaration of independence, but also for the way that they, NATO intervened in former Yugoslavia. So this would have been a very good turning point to say, look, there is a decision which we respect, and we take this decision to recognize Kosovo, because the biggest problem in relation to the EU's ability to solve the Kosovo-Serbia issue is the fact that, the intra-EU problems are huge in relation to Kosovo. I mean, look at the EU. They don't even know how to call us. There is an asterisk. There is it's very complicated to navigate around it with the 5 non-recognizers on board. So this is, it could have been used, but then, how many times, even North Macedonia has won cases in the International Court of Justice. Yet again, it wasn't enough. I think when the EU incentive is there, when there is political will, things can work, which is, the previous cases that you are mentioning in Central Eastern European countries, but also, I mean, there was this arbitrary decision on Piran Bay, which still, Croatia and Slovenia complained to the EU about it, but there was this incentive, they made it to the EU, now it's a minor, it's it exists, but it's not persisting, it doesn't kill the overall, the functioning of the countries or them being around each other. But lacking this incentive, which is EU membership process, that's why we're having these problems, because the EU does not have this, tool through which it tried to incentivize, the Western Balkan countries to solve their bilateral issues. On bilateral issues, it can be externalized, but I think that work should be done in 3 layers, on 3 layers. There is one that is bilateral, countries between each other. I mean, there is Greece and Albania. You constantly see them talking about their issue, but it's not like a very, very sensitive that, sparks potential tensions or conflicts. There is the regional one, in which the EU launches these regional, sort of projects in which they try to sort of make countries talk to each other or cooperate in a larger sort of, sphere. And then there is, this EU level, which is, the negotiations with the EU, but also the EU membership process as an overarching goal. So I think all 3 of them should work, perfectly fine, and at the same time for it to actually function. Because Western Balkans has a lot of issues, of obviously those that are open, those that are, we see them sort of appearing in the future. But I mean, have you ever mapped Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia? I mean, come on, Georgia has, you know, like two regions which look like northern part of Kosovo. They don't even pay electricity the way, you know, the Serbs in northern part of Kosovo do not pay electricity. There are so many similarities. So the EU should know how to navigate around them in order to also, you know, design its approach to a new region that it's aspiring to enlarge to. And then on your overall question, what should be done? Apart from bilaterals, but also enlargement, there is one, the EU, obviously the intra-EU reforms. It is very much needed and it has to be done and it has to be done in parallel with enlargement. I mean, it doesn't have to be either or, and this debate should be led obviously by bigger member states, but, you know, never think of, okay, let's, you know, deal with our own issues and then we deal with, you know, the rest, because status quo and this, you know, sort of limbo, it did not work. You know, it was really bad in the past 20 years in the Balkans. It did not become better. The status quo did not stay as a status quo. It became worse. It became worse. So it's like this should be done. Second one is to define this overarching goal. What is enlargement? Are they going to be periphery? Are they going to be, you know, part of the EU? What is EPC? How does it feed to the enlargement? What's going to be the level of cooperation between these two new regions and what we know as, you know, the EU? And then focus on values. This is very important. You mentioned Estonia, but then there is Poland as well.
Yeah,
and
I mentioned the best value.
Exactly, you mentioned the best, and I'm bringing the worst, because we from the Western Balkans, unfortunately, when you see the political elites, there are two different messages that are being sent by the EU, right? So there is like the best case scenario, which is Estonia or like other, you know, all democracies or whatever, and then there is, you know, Hungary and Poland. And unfortunately, there is, you know, the political will for enlargement comes from Hungary and Poland, because not because they want a democratic region or a region that joins the EU and prospers, but because they want more autocrats on board to challenge the old democracies and to challenge the intra-EU decision-making process. So the EU should define goals, but also the messages that it sends. This is very important. Sorry, Florent. And something I wanted to say since the very beginning, because we will talk about methodology, state accession, and everything. It's we conducted with BIEPAG 2 studies in France and in the Netherlands on, you know, the opinion polls on EU enlargement towards Western Balkans. First of all, congratulations, France did a good job, because the knowledge about Western Balkans, but also about the EU was, you know, basically more present than in the Netherlands. It's very interesting to see like how education systems or like the narrative has been shaped around it. Second of all is the fact that, you know, like there is like 30 to 40% sort of approval for Western Balkans to join the EU, but the question should be, is it salient? Will a voter in France, South France, go to a voting station and say like, oh, I'll see what this government says about Western Balkans, specifically in enlargement, and then I will decide on how to vote? No, it's not that salient. But what the EU and also us, I agree with Alexander, is that we really have to work on building our narratives. What we have done in the Balkans is like we constantly sort of portrayed ourselves as tensions, war for 20 years, right? In the EU, the governments should not make it an election issue, because it is not, because the Western Balkans is small, significantly smaller than Ukraine itself. So building this narrative around enlargement, which would be more positive than negative, would help you as well to sort of tell the EU that bringing them on board is more beneficial than it's negative.
I'll come back to this narrative question, but first on this gradual accession. You're raising the question, Dominique, what is the overarching goal? You're also raising the same question. There is a need to increase the materiality of the process by making benefits more visible also for within the region, and the gradual accession proposal is a way to do that. But we need to think about it in relation to what is the overarching goal. Is the overarching goal to have a more differentiated integration in the European polity we are building? So it means more heterogeneity too. So that would be the downside. What is the overarching, and how, especially how to make sure if the overarching goal is not to have more differentiated integration altogether, just a transitory phase. How do we make sure that this is a transitory phase? Poland was supposed to take the euro crisis. It was just transitory, that they are not. And there are many other examples of things which are supposed to be transitory, which just remain as they are. So how do we make sure that we don't lose sight of the overarching goal, if this overarching goal is to have a cohesive political union, not a differentiated composite of states?
Do I have 6 hours?
Let's tell.
But there's the question of differentiated status, I would say, before accession, and that's why the different models of stage accession are about, and differentiation when you're in the EU. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not sure that the second issue is something that we really need to address today. I mean, we have the tools of differentiation into the EU, be it enhanced cooperations or the accession pledge or obligation to Eurozone. But for me, what we really need to debate today is really the stage accession possibilities. The models are very thorough, especially the one from Belgrade. But now, as it's getting more attention, especially in the Commission, as we saw from the Bratislava speech by Ursula von der Leyen, we need a bit to question it, or to see where are maybe the flaws, where are the limits, and that means first, I think, in terms of legally, especially does the last stage of this proposal, that is being in the EU without a voting right, without possibility to veto, is this possible without treaty change? I doubt it, but I think that we need to be clear about it. The question of the status, and therefore, but that's what you mentioned, the length of this transitionary period of being an associating member of, or whatever you call it. I don't know how long this is sustainable, because what we've seen is that status, that means being considered as a state on an equal footing with others, something that countries and their citizens accept maybe for some years, but not very long as well. Because one of the symbolic aim of joining the EU is, what I understand, and what is it's also normalizing the status of the country, showing that basically you're not only a sovereign state, but a state on an equal footing with all other European states. And then there's the question of, I would say, the sequencing of the different association to different EU policies. And for me, the trickiest one being, should we start with internal market or end with internal market? Because internal market, of course, is a lot of opportunities of economic development. It's also a huge competitive pressure on the countries, be it on the economies, but also pressure on the labor market with what I mentioned already, the risk of a brain drain. So for me, really, when talking about transition period, it's much more discussing about those different models that are getting traction in EU capitals. It was discussed, I think, in Copenhagen 2 days ago, and there's quite a lot of success. In the Commission as well. The Commission was tasked by the European Council June last year to carry out work on those ideas, and I hope that the Commission will come with some ideas. And lastly, we need to make sure that candidate countries, and especially their governments, would be comfortable with this idea, and especially with the one that I mentioned, the length of the transitionary phase, and to what extent this is acceptable to their citizens, and to what extent this is credible, that this will not be an endless waiting room.
The proposals are working on the assumption that there will, so through conditionality, that the reforms will be performed and democracy will be consolidated. It is linked to receiving more material incentives and technical assistance too. But again, if you look at what happens now in Serbia with protests, massive protests, how do we fit that together? We are trying to do more of the same conditionality, but at the same time we have these movements. They certainly need more conditionality, and we have calls from the opposition, so why not have sanctions? But is it enough as a tool? Is it working, just conditionality to build democracy, to consolidate them? Or do we need something more?
Conditionality should work, but only if applied strictly, right? Strict and fair. So now I sound like I'm Dutch, but like basically it's how you apply it. It's not whether, you know, the tool is work. I mean, that's a tool. So it can work if you know how to use it. But if you don't, if you make it flexible, if you make your values flexible, then of course the other party is going to find ways to actually, you know, play the game and sort of have the scenario that we have in the Western Balkans. That's my biggest fear with stage accession. Stage accession is a good idea in the absence of, you know, the actual membership, because then the EU still, you know, this incentive is blurred. Speaking of from the point of view of someone coming from Kosovo, this incrementalism scares me, because, you know, this incremental approach was believed to also be a success, you know, sort of a successful tool in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, but it wasn't, because it depends on the time frame, it depends on how well you define each stage. Because, I mean, it's good to have an incremental approach, so, you know, it doesn't scare the EU member states, but also sort of prepares us to join the EU, conduct the reforms, have access to funds which are very much needed in order to carry out all these reforms. But it has to be like very clear in the time frame, each stage and what stage, and in which stage countries elevate, you know, their take an extra step towards EU membership, and what do they have to do in return. I am very, very concerned about, you know, the bilaterals here, because where do you get actually, you know, to solve your bilaterals? In which stage of this incremental stage accession phase you will do that? Because if you ask Vučić, you will say like, in the end. But then, you know, going to that end might take forever. And this, you know, might put the EU in this, you know, trap, which is a never-ending game in which there are no winners. The winners are autocrats. There are no EU and there is no Western Balkans citizens, but there is, you know, political elites which are autocratic. So it has to be like very well planned. It has to be very well sort of thoroughly followed up by the EU, but also member states, and not put it on commission and say like, oh, we did this, we agreed on this, and let's see each other after 10 years and see if it works or not, because that's also very risky. We have no time to lose, because not brain drain, just not only the qualified people are moving, but also like general population, middle class, everybody would move at some point if there is no prospect in the region. And then, you know, like the last one is like, yeah, access to funds. But if you don't have a sustainable system to actually make sure that these funds are being used properly, then who benefits from the funds? This is also the big question mark. You have to build rule of law, judicial, insist on that before, you know, given this staged accession form, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. It will be another status quo.
Thank you, Danica. Thank you, Alexander. In the debates we have today, it's interesting because there is a mix of the old and the new. There is always, it's probably a good and wise thing to have, but there are things which have been put on the table for many years. So about supporting democracy, being so more looking at how things are implemented and so on and so forth. But there is all new also sphere of debates which are adding up. Now the question is very much how to combine the two. Knowing that everything is shifting very quickly. But we are very glad that we could host this debate in Paris and this morning. And we'd like to thank all of you, Dominique also, for hosting us in ifri. And I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.